What happens when one of Hollywood's sharpest tongues meets late-night television's most notorious host? You won't believe what unfolds when David Spade sits down with Jimmy Kimmel for what was supposed to be a routine promotional appearance. The night started like any other, but within minutes the atmosphere turned ice-cold, setting the stage for one of the most explosive confrontations in late-night history. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what happens next. The studio lights were blazing hot as David Spade walked onto the Jimmy Kimmel live set, flashing his trademark sardonic smile to the audience. The comedian had been making his rounds promoting his latest Netflix special, and this was supposed to be just another stop on the publicity circuit. But from the moment he settled into the guest chair, something felt different. The usual pre-interview banter between host and guest was noticeably absent, replaced by an uncomfortable silence that seemed to stretch forever. Kimmel opened with what appeared to be standard fare, welcoming Spade with his characteristic grin that never quite reached his eyes. "David Spade, everybody. Thanks for being here tonight." The applause was polite but lukewarm, and Spade's response was equally measured. "Thanks for having me, Jimmy. Always a pleasure." But even those simple words carried an undercurrent of tension that the studio audience couldn't quite place. The interview began innocuously enough, with Kimmel asking about Spade's new material and upcoming tour dates. Spade answered with his usual dry wit, getting some genuine laughs from the crowd. But seasoned viewers of both comedians could sense something brewing beneath the surface. Kimmel's questions seemed more pointed than usual, delivered with an edge that suggested this wasn't going to be the typical softball celebrity interview. "So, David, you've been doing stand-up for what, 30 years now?" Kimmel asked, leaning back in his chair with that practiced casual pose that didn't fool anyone who knew him. "That's a long time to be telling jokes for a living." Spade's eyebrow arched slightly. "Well, Jimmy, some of us actually write our own material." The comment landed like a small bomb in the studio. The audience wasn't sure whether to laugh or gasp, sensing they'd just witnessed something that went beyond typical comedic sparring. Kimmel's smile tightened almost imperceptibly, but he pressed on. "Speaking of material, I noticed you've been pretty vocal on social media lately about the state of comedy. Some might say you're stuck in the past, complaining about how things used to be better." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Spade shifted in his chair, his posture becoming more defensive. "I wouldn't say stuck in the past, Jimmy. I'd say I remember when comedy actually required talent instead of just reading off cue cards and hoping the laugh track covers the silence." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the usually reliable audience seemed to hold its collective breath, realizing they were witnessing something unprecedented. Kimmel's face flushed slightly, but he maintained his composure with the skill of someone who'd been doing this for years. "That's interesting," Kimmel replied, his voice carrying a new hardness, "because I seem to remember you doing pretty well for yourself, reading lines off cue cards on Saturday Night Live. Or was that different somehow?" Spade's eyes narrowed, and for the first time since sitting down he looked genuinely angry. "SNL was live television, Jimmy. We were creating something new every week, taking risks, pushing boundaries. We weren't just recycling the same tired, political jokes night after night, pandering to whatever gets the most clicks." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a gun. Kimmel's carefully constructed facade began to crack, revealing glimpses of the man behind the late-night persona. His laugh was forced, mechanical. "Well, David, at least I didn't spend the last decade doing guest spots on basic cable sitcoms that nobody watches." The personal attack was unmistakable, and Spade's reaction was immediate. He sat up straighter, his voice taking on a razor-sharp edge that anyone who'd watched him eviscerate celebrities on Weekend Update would recognize. "At least I earned my spots, Jimmy. I didn't get handed a show because I was willing to say whatever the network wanted me to say." The studio audience was now completely silent, sensing they were witnessing something that was spiraling far beyond the usual boundaries of late-night television. Even the cameramen seemed uncertain about how to frame this escalating confrontation. Kimmel leaned forward, his mask of hospitality finally slipping completely. "You know what, David? Maybe that's your problem. Maybe you never learned how to evolve with the times. Maybe that's why you're sitting in the guest chair instead of behind the desk." The words struck like a physical blow, and Spade's face went pale with rage. His hands gripped the arms of his chair so tightly his knuckles went white. The carefully maintained pretense of a friendly interview had shattered completely, leaving two comedians facing off like gladiators in an arena of confused silence. But this was only the beginning. What happened next would make those opening salvos look like gentle ribbing between old friends. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity before Spade found his voice, and when he spoke, his words cut through the studio air like a blade. "You know what, Jimmy? At least when I bomb on stage, I don't have a team of writers to blame it on. At least I don't hide behind political cheap shots because I can't come up with actual comedy anymore." Kimmel's face went from flushed to deep red, his carefully maintained composure crumbling in real time. The audience could sense they were witnessing something that had gone far beyond entertainment into genuine hostility. "Political cheap shots?" Kimmel's voice rose slightly, losing the practiced modulation of his television persona. "At least I'm not afraid to have an opinion about something that matters. At least I don't spend my time making jokes about airline food and dating apps like it's still 1995. The personal nature of the attack was unmistakable, and Spade's response was immediate and devastating. "Opinion? Is that what you call reading? Talking points off a teleprompter while your audience claps like trained seals? You've turned comedy into propaganda, Jimmy. You've made it safe, sanitized, and completely soulless." The words hit their target with surgical precision. Kimmel's jaw tightened visibly, and for a moment, the mask slipped completely. The genial host disappeared, replaced by someone who looked genuinely furious. "Soulless? That's rich, coming from someone whose biggest contribution to comedy was playing the same sarcastic character for 20 years. Tell me, David, when was, the last time you took a real risk? When was the last time you said something that actually mattered?" Spade leaned forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried more menace than shouting. "Every time I step on stage, Jimmy. Every time I don't have a safety net of network executives telling me what's acceptable to say. Every time I trust the audience to be smart enough to get a joke without having to explain why it's supposed to be funny." The studio audience was now completely transfixed, caught between fascination and horror at what they were witnessing. This wasn't the scripted conflict of professional wrestling or the manufactured drama of reality television. This was two seasoned performers letting their genuine animosity spill out in front of millions of viewers. Kimmel stood up abruptly, his chair rolling backward with the force of his movement. The sudden action sent a ripple of tension through the studio that was almost palpable. "You want to talk about trust, David? Let's talk about trust. Let's talk about how you've spent the last 5 years on Twitter complaining about everyone else's success while your own career slowly circles the drain." The brutality of the statement left even Spade momentarily speechless. The camera operators seemed frozen, unsure whether to cut away or keep rolling as the confrontation escalated beyond anything in late-night television history. When Spade finally responded, his voice was steady but filled with barely contained rage. "My career is circling the drain? That's funny, Jimmy, because last time I checked, your ratings have been in free fall for 3 years. Maybe that's what happens when you replace comedy with lectures. Maybe that's what happens when you forget that your job is to entertain people, not to tell them how to think." The accusation struck home like a physical blow. Kimmel's composure, already hanging by threads, finally snapped completely. "At least, I'm not a relic from the Clinton administration desperately trying to stay relevant by attacking people who actually matter in this business." The personal venom in his voice was unmistakable, and the studio fell into a silence so complete that The hum of the air conditioning seemed deafening. Spade's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, hurt, and finally, cold fury. People who actually matter? Spade's voice was quiet now, but it carried the kind of intensity that made everyone in the studio lean forward. Jimmy, the only reason you matter is because a network decided you were safe enough to put on television. You're not a comedian anymore. You're a corporate spokesperson with a desk and a fake laugh. The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Kimmel's response came with the force of years of pent-up frustration and ego. Fake laugh? At least I don't have to rely on being mean-spirited to get a reaction. At least I don't punch down at people just to feel better about my own failures. Spade was on his feet now, matching Kimmel's aggressive posture. The pretense of a civil interview had completely evaporated, leaving two angry men facing off across a late-night television set. Punch down? Jimmy, I've been punching up my entire career. I've been taking shots at people with more power, more money, more influence. You punch down at anyone who disagrees with your politics while hiding behind the excuse that you're just a comedian. The confrontation had reached a fever pitch, with both men now standing, their voices raised enough that the studio audience could feel the genuine hostility radiating from the stage. The cameras continued to roll, capturing every moment of what was rapidly becoming one of the most explosive celebrity confrontations in television history. But the worst was yet to come, and what happened next would cross a line that neither man could uncross. Kimmel's face contorted with rage as he pointed an accusatory finger at Spade. You want to know what your real problem is, David? You're bitter. You're bitter because while everyone else evolved, you stayed exactly the same. You're bitter because the world moved on without you, and now you're just another has-been desperately trying to cling to relevance by tearing down people who actually succeeded. The words were designed to wound, and they found their mark. Spade's face went pale, then flushed with anger that seemed to radiate from his entire body. When he spoke, his voice was trembling with fury. Has been? Jimmy, I've been doing this since you were probably watching me on TV in your dorm room, dreaming about one day being half as funny as the people you now pretend to be better than. Kimmel laughed, but it was a harsh, ugly sound devoid of any humor. Half as funny? David, you peaked in 1994. You've been coasting on Weekend Update catchphrases for 3 decades. At least I'm not afraid to use my platform for something more than just cheap shots and nostalgia. The studio audience was now completely silent, sensing they were witnessing something that had crossed from professional disagreement into personal destruction. Even the crew seemed frozen, unsure whether to intervene or continue recording what was rapidly becoming television history for all the wrong reasons. Spade's response came with the precision of a surgeon and the brutality of an executioner. Platform? Jimmy, your platform is a corporate soapbox. You don't have opinions, you have instructions. You don't make jokes, you make statements. And the saddest part is, you've convinced yourself that makes you important instead of just another puppet. With better ratings. The accusation struck Kimmel like a physical blow. His face cycled through emotions, shock, hurt, and finally, uncontrolled rage. Puppet? At least I'm not a washed-up character actor who never learned the difference between confidence and arrogance. At least I don't mistake being mean for being clever. Spade stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried more menace than shouting. Mean? Jimmy, everything I've ever said on stage was honest. Can you say the same? Can you honestly tell this audience that anything you've said tonight came from your heart, instead of from some focus group's talking points? The challenge hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down, and Kimmel's response revealed just how deep the wound had gone. You want honesty, David? Here's honesty. You're here tonight because your publicist begged my producers to book you. You're here because nobody else would take the meeting. You're here because this is the biggest audience you'll see all year and we both know it. The cruelty of the statement was breathtaking. The studio fell into a silence so complete that the only sound was the barely audible hum of the cameras still rolling. Spade's face went through a transformation, from anger to hurt to something much more dangerous. When he finally spoke, his words were measured, deliberate, and devastating. "You're right, Jimmy. This is the biggest audience I'll see all year, which means millions of people just watched you reveal exactly who you really are. They just watched you show them that behind all the fake concern and manufactured outrage, you're just another Hollywood bully who mistakes cruelty for strength." Kimmel opened his mouth to respond, but Spade wasn't finished. "And you know what the really sad part is? 10 years ago, I actually respected you. I thought you were one of the good ones. I thought you understood that comedy was supposed to bring people together, not tear them apart. But I was wrong. You're not a comedian anymore, Jimmy. You're just another angry man with a microphone, and that's all you'll ever be." The words landed with the force of a final verdict, and for a moment Kimmel looked genuinely stricken. But his response, when it came, crossed the line from professional rivalry into something much darker. "At least I'm not a pathetic old man, desperately trying to stay relevant by attacking people who actually matter. At least I don't have to look in the mirror every morning and see someone who peaked when Clinton was president." The personal venom in his voice was unmistakable, and it seemed to suck all the oxygen out of the studio. Spade stared at him for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was calm, almost conversational. "You know what, Jimmy? I've been in this business long enough to know when someone's trying to destroy me. And I've been around long enough to know that the only people who try that hard are the ones who are already destroying themselves." Spade turned toward the audience, his voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence. "Ladies and gentlemen, I came here tonight to talk about comedy, to maybe make you laugh, to remind you that entertainment used to be about bringing joy into people's lives. Instead, you got to see something else entirely. You got to see what happens when someone forgets that being on television is a privilege, not a right." He turned back to Kimmel, who was standing frozen behind his desk, his face a mask of rage and something that might have been shame. "Jimmy, I hope this was worth it. I hope whatever you thought you were going to accomplish tonight was worth showing your audience exactly who you really are." The studio remained in stunned silence as Spade walked toward the edge of the stage. He paused for a moment, looking back at Kimmel with something that might have been pity. "Good luck with your ratings, Jimmy. Something tells me you're going to need it." Without another word, David Spade walked off the Jimmy Kimmel Live set, leaving behind a studio full of shocked silence and a host who looked like he just realized he'd made a terrible mistake. The cameras kept rolling, capturing every moment of Kimmel's stunned expression as he stood alone behind his desk, the weight of what had just happened settling over the studio like a suffocating blanket. The confrontation was over, but the damage was done. In the space of one disastrous interview, 2 careers had been irrevocably changed, and an audience had witnessed the ugly side of celebrity that rarely sees the light of day. As the studio lights dimmed and the stunned audience filed out in uncomfortable silence, one thing was certain. This was a night that would be remembered long after the cameras stopped rolling.